So, if you were like me and developed an interest in film photography, you most likely became quickly aware of the existence of the Yashica T4 and T5 and its legendary status as a point and shoot film camera. You may have heard of the fashion photographer Terry Richardson, who's largely credited for putting the Yashica T4 on the map. Or perhaps you're more familiar with the works of Gunnar Stahl, whose portraits got many folks interested in emulating his style of photography by searching for the types of cameras he uses, one of them being the Yashica T4 Super D, aka the Yashica T5. Aside from this, there's a slew of YouTube videos and forum posts praising the capabilities of the T4 and T5. However, for every time someone celebrates these cameras, there always seems to be a group of vocal individuals saying that these cameras are overhyped, overpriced, or the photos they take just aren't that good. So, in this video, I'm going to talk about my own experiences with the Yashica T5 in particular, and discuss how good of a camera I personally think it is. Additionally, I'll also be talking about whether the Yashica T5 is worth its ever increasing price tag. Holding the T5 for the first time, you notice its chunky form factor and cheap plastic body. In general, this camera's design is fairly simple and nothing to write home about. Except on top of the camera, next to the viewfinder, there's a very small waist level viewfinder to use to compose your photos without having to bring the regular viewfinder right up to your face. It's a rarely seen feature for a point and shoot camera and was one of the main reasons as to why I was so intrigued by the Yashica T5 over the T4. Sure, it's a bit gimmicky and the waist level viewfinder is hard to see out of, but once you get used to it, it can be handy in taking shots more discreetly or just nice when taking photos from a low angle without being in too much of an awkward position. Other than this one unusual feature, this camera is about as easy as it gets for people to use to take photos with. You open the shutter, look through the viewfinder, and take your photo. However, this is where it can get a little bit tricky in certain situations. There have been a handful of times where myself or a friend of mine will try to take a photo in a place with little to no lighting. In these situations, we'll inevitably be faced with the frustrating situation of taking an extra 3 seconds to actually find the viewfinder before taking the shot. And while 3 seconds might not sound like that much on paper, even a fraction of a second can be all that it takes in missing a beautifully candid or spontaneous photo. It's a bit of a shame because I really think this camera thrives in those darker settings due to the T5's flash having the perfect level of intensity to light up each scene really well. Very rarely will the T5's flash leave my photos being too washed out or too underlit. When it comes to settings on this camera, there's a 10-second self-timer, red eye reduction, flash on or off, and shooting at infinity. This camera lacks settings that you'll typically find in top-of-the-line point-and-shoots such as exposure compensation, aperture priority, manual ISO settings, and flash on-off memory. It is a little annoying to have your flash settings reset back to auto mode every time you close and reopen the shutter, but you get used to it fairly quickly. So, given all the limitations of this camera and its cheap, plasticky build, why is the T5 so heavily sought after? Simply put, the camera produces great images. For an old point and shoot, the lens is quite sharp and more importantly in my opinion, the autofocus is very spot on. With that said, I remember using this camera for the first time. The cheap plastic body and limited settings left a bad impression on me. But when I got the scans back from the lab, I gotta say I was really impressed with the results. And this also seems to align with the general consensus among T5 users. They say that holding the camera and taking photos with it reminds them of a typical point and shoot, except the photos it produces are of quality that you'll typically only see in top-of-the-line point and shoot cameras. It's a point and shoot with a standard look and feel to it, but it just so happens to take really sharp and beautiful pictures. In other words, the Yashica T5 is premium, but not quite premium. One might say it's the in-between point of the Olympus Mu 2 and the Contax T2 in terms of image quality and autofocus reliability. With this in mind and recognizing the T5's cult following and the popularity of the Yashica T series lineup in general, it is easy to see why the camera has dramatically increased in price over the years. I can imagine it being 10 years ago when film was a much more niche hobby to undertake. It wouldn't surprise me if people would often recommend the T5 as a go-to point and shoot given its much cheaper price relative to its image quality and autofocus reliability back then. However, it's no longer the late 2000s or the early 2010s anymore. Film photography is now a much more popular hobby for people to be engaged in, and working Yashica T5s are dwindling in numbers. So really, it's going to be hard to come across a good deal for this camera. In my eyes, the T5 will only continue to inflate in price year after year for the foreseeable future. I love this camera. It definitely has its flaws, but I can't deny the fun I have while using it. However, if you're looking to experience the quality photos that the Yashica T5 can produce, I'd actually recommend 95% of people to go for the Yashica T4 instead. Aside from the waist level viewfinder of the T5, the T4 offers just as much image sharpness and autofocus accuracy. The T5 is essentially a T4 with a waist level viewfinder tacked on. While I personally enjoy the tiny waist level viewfinder of the T5 from time to time, I suspect that most people will find it impractical with just how hard it can be to look through such a small viewfinder. Plus, the T4 works out to be a slightly cheaper camera to buy, as well as having a thinner form factor. Regardless, no matter which option you go for, both the T4 and T5 are really expensive cameras for what you actually get in return, which makes it hard for me to recommend to most people. I know I praise the T5's capabilities as a film point and shoot, but do keep in mind the flaws of this camera that I've mentioned. Basically, if you find a good deal on a T5 and you want to experiment with its small waist level viewfinder, then go for it. If you don't care about the small waist level viewfinder of the T5, which I assume is most people, I'd recommend looking around for a good deal on a T4 instead, or look for other cheaper alternatives that'll achieve similar results. So those are my final thoughts on the Yashica T5. Feel free to leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts on this camera. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.